Hi, I'm Mark Rosano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network. So today on the Econ Show, it's a shorter one because I'm going away tomorrow, so we wanted to try to get something out, and we wanted to look at obviously the geopolitical uncertainty that's surrounding what's happening in Israel at the moment. We want to look at other regional flare-ups. Obviously, this has moved into a war. We want to talk about what are the impacts right now, where are we to this point, and then what comes next, because there are a lot of ramifications that branch out from the specific region. Then we're going to move to global growth, how that is impacting things, especially when you look at emerging markets, and obviously it's very much linked back to Israel and other regional flare-ups that we've seen. And then we want to look at US wages slowing faster, and then we're going to finish up with a bit of an international roundup, but with a focal point on China's Golden Week disappointing. So just kind of jumping in, we want to rehash what we discussed back in February of 2021 first, to talk about how epidemics and unrest and how they go hand in hand. So one of the things that we had talked of what comes after COVID, our view was that you were going to see a large amount of unrest. And the way we described that were tribal differences that were going to flare up. We're seeing it in Kosovo, Bosnia. We're seeing it in Azerbaijan, Armenia. We obviously saw it just recently in Israel and Gaza. And we've seen it already in large parts, or I should say several key parts of Africa. So it starts as regional, and it's important to look at how the U.S. fits into this, because I think we've gotten away from the importance of the Truman Doctrine and really what Teddy Roosevelt kind of set out with: carry a big, walk softly, but carry a big stick. And I think we have to make sure that we step up into the policeman role, because the last thing you want is to take a step back and say, this is someone else's problem. And then that compounds itself and it spreads. And the whole goal of the Truman Doctrine, if you boil it down, and again, I'm simplifying a lot of things and I understand that, but the Truman Doctrine is having smaller skirmishes avoids the bigger altercation. And that's a key piece of what things are. And that's why when there was a lot of pushback from both parties, especially the Republican Party on Ukraine, it's like, well, if we help Ukraine in ways that we can without putting boots on the ground, well, that helps cordon off Russia. That essentially bleeds down their resources without putting human American lives at risk. Obviously, Ukrainian lives are at risk every day. And that's a big component of, well, keep it compartmentalized. Try to support what you can, drain assets of the opposing person, try to support NATO in different ways, and having NATO support Ukraine. And then when you branch that out, and we want to talk about that because there was a potential attack on a gas line. Then when you take a step back and look at some of these other regions, we also have Americans at risk. We've seen some of the massive atrocities that have happened within Israel, and it continues to get worse as more information comes out. We have to respond quickly and decisively. And that is how we maintain our standards as Americans in terms of where we like to think of what our flag represents and how we represent ourselves abroad in terms of trying to bring peace and order, whether that be from support, from a logistical standpoint, from an intelligence standpoint, whether that comes to helping rescue hostages or running some sort of operation that is trying to get in prior to the bigger ground invasion, which is inevitable. So when we start looking at what has happened so far in Israel and Gaza, I think this is a very good map that shows just how far Gaza, the Hamas was able to breach the border. And there's been some tinfoil hats that have asked, how could this have happened? This is absurd. There is nothing like the quiet to have people let down their guard. And for the most part, there has been a fair amount of quiet activity at the border. And typically, when you're the the enemy that is trying to use a surprise tactic, you want the other side to become complacent. So when you look at the Israeli government, there were brigades, full brigades that were being pulled into different directions. They wanted them in the West Bank. They wanted them in different areas. This was the end of Sukkot, the holiday. So when you look at timing, it was perfect. And that's when you have to kind of respect what the Hamas did when you look at military timing. Obviously, you cannot not respect what has happened and what they carried out, because they didn't just attack military operations or police operations, but obviously civilians. It's just you have to respect your opponent in terms of what they were able to devise, not only just internally, but also with the help of outside actors. Now it's a matter of how do you respond and how do you cordon off further infringement into Israel? Because when you look at the Hezbollah of the north, when you look at Lebanon, you look at Hamas in Gaza, and then Houthis in Yemen, there's a certain amount of coordination between them that has to be looked at. Now, Iran, depending on who you've heard, they've said that they helped plan it. Then other people are saying, well, we really didn't. Realistically, they likely supported and helped in different ways, because Israel was in the process of normalizing negotiating normalized relations with Saudi Arabia. Israel had already done it with the UAE and Bahrain. Kuwait said they would be the last to do it. So Saudi, for those that remember, in March of this year, Saudi and Iran put aside their differences. They said, look, we're going to respect each other's sovereignty. We're going to ignore what's happening within each other's country, and we'll peacefully ignore each other. And now that, obviously, if Israel moved closer to Saudi, that would create another powerful military in the region that is against the Iranian government as they try to expand. And the reason why it's important to say Iranian government is because Iran, don't put them into one bucket. Like we've seen different periods where, especially at a most recent soccer match, where they showed a Palestinian flag and the Iranians said, shove that flag up your bleep. And it's because the Iranian people are not represented by the regime. The regime is something separate. Biden had released $6 billion to them in terms of what was locked up capital. And unfortunately, and this is what the people of Iran are struggling with, it's like every time money comes in, it gets filtered into proxies. And the Iranian people are like, we're being left behind. They haven't managed their water assets. They haven't managed farming. They haven't protected different things. Unemployment at critical levels within Iran. They don't want to finance these things. Then you look at Lebanon, there are Lebanese that wouldn't let Hezbollah pass through their towns because they're like, they are tired of this as well. Then you look at Egypt. So Egypt has normalized relations with Israel. Israel has helped Egypt with the Sinai Peninsula, but again, they've also normalized some operations with gas and LNG. So when you look at the disruption, and it's really Iran, a Shia entity that is using Sunni pawns that will kind of grasp at any money or help to infiltrate and create a very sophisticated attack that was practiced out in the open. So people have said, how can these things get overrun? Well, people get complacent. You had areas that were unmanned. You had equipment that hadn't been checked. You had an over-reliance on electronics that can be disabled based on well-timed explosions, jamming, and just overwhelming forces. I mean, that's how you do this, and you do it all together at once, which is why this was a very sophisticated attack that definitely took over planning. And I think when you start looking at how far they got, you get an idea of how underprepared the Israelis were. And this is the underlying problem. They couldn't get IDF into positions to support, which then created these these horrible atrocities that we've seen. But now the question is, well, what comes next? So when you look at what Hamas has done, now Israel has to try to clear and push everything back into Gaza while they're trying to avoid a northern attack. There's been increased fighting within Lebanon. This is trying to, again, pin back Hezbollah. There's several launching points. There was Israel hit a Iranian supply line within Syria. Then there was also some skirmishes where Israel technically has like a buffer within Syria, and we'll show that in a minute. But this is a very important feat because when you look at Hamas forces from Gaza conducted attacks as far as Rahat, and it gives you an idea of how far they were able to penetrate and just the level of attack. So now the Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group is moving closer to Israel. It should be there today. The Carrier Strike Group has guided missile systems. It has a significant amount of activity. And it's important to, again, show solidarity, but not to ignore that, because there are some people that have said, well, we're pulling assets from other regions. It's like, well, we have to show strength. And we have facilities and equipment in areas, so we're not taking our eye off the ball. We're trying to, again, portray what needs to be portrayed and support the coming ground invasion that is on the horizon. So when you start looking at what that ground invasion would look like, you have to appreciate the population density. It's not uniform. They're obviously the Israelis are going to use very specific tactics to try to soften areas, but you are moving into an urban warfare. It's not as tight as some of the others. And they have struck out at what could be some of this contentious area. So Gaza is not as contiguous urban area. So when you look at the tactics, techniques, methods to get citizens out of combat areas before attacks, the Israelis continue to use what's called roof knocking, where a small detonation lands on the roof, blows up. It's a knock, letting you know that within the next 10 to 30 minutes, that asset will be destroyed. They send text messages. They send through both WhatsApp as well as SMS. But again, then the question goes, well, where do they go? Because Egypt is restricting crossing. Because again, how do you know what's coming from Gaza into Egypt? And this is where it becomes difficult in terms of those that don't want to be controlled by Hamas. But again, unfortunately, it's hard to distinguish given the level of infiltration Hamas has within the region. So there have been other strikes, which has caused things on the naval side. They've been launching extensive rocket attacks, and that's why there is a move to go into Gaza and eliminate the Hamas risk to this point. This gives you an idea of what the ground scale looked like in 2014. And think about it. I mean, almost 9 years ago at this point, you had a full-scale invasion to the point of shutting down. And for those that don't remember, at this point, you had you had tunnels that were being dug underneath the border and popping up all around. So this was to come in, clear those regions, and then build essentially walls that went below ground. And the view was that this was effective, and that the effectiveness, which it was, then created that complacency that then continued to expand. The Israelis have formed a united government. You do have some wartime consigliere type structure now, and it's going to be a matter of bringing up reservists. This gives you an idea of what the positions look like in 2014. The size and scale is going to be much larger. I believe in this one, they pulled up 79,000 reservists. I think to date, they're up to about 360,000, moving to 390,000. So again, because the view is this could become, if not already is, a two-front war, which is when you look at Lebanon, and then when you look at when you look at what has happened in the other Gaza region. So it's important here when you look at how is this going to affect things going forward? Because we'll show a chart in a moment. When you look at Ashdod and Ashdod, those are two areas that are very important. So Ashdod is an area that has where the natural gas comes in and then bumps down into Egypt. And Ashdod is actually where there's a lot of the potash, if not, I think all the potash is shipped from. So these are two key ports that are essentially seeing their action restricted because of these rocket attacks. Ashdod also has the largest desalination plant in the world. So again, this is going to become a much bigger issue. Now, these are pinch points, which are very important to understand. So the Suez Canal is obviously going to be very important. A lot of LNG traverses through the Suez in order to get into Europe. So Yemen, that's the Houthis control that little boot right there. And then obviously Israel has helped Egypt maintain or eliminate ISIS within the Sinai Peninsula. But if you get Hamas that can get over the border and into Egypt, they can disrupt Suez actions, which is, again, another reason why the U.S. has to be there in order to maintain the lines of communication amongst the different parties, but also the lines of, or I should say, the shipping lanes. Then Yemen, Houthis have said that if Israel launches its ground attack, this will create a much bigger response. So that's where when you look at the Houthis, they could do something there. And then obviously the Hezbollah are trying to move assets in. Iran is technically being shown as the controlling entity within that. So the Strait of Hormuz becomes another issue because they could mine it, they could try to use their naval assets, and it's important that we have our assets that have the ability to respond quickly in multiple regions. Now, Saudi Arabia has gone back and forth in public. They have said that all dealings with Israel are off the table. In the background, that is not true. It definitely delayed things, but it hasn't really dissuaded them fully. There's different responses based on what is publicly said, what MBS has said. So it's going to be important to see how this shifts over time, because this is a very obviously fluid situation. Now, when you look at Iraq, so the Badr organization is one of the largest when you look at assets within Iraq. This is going to be important because they have said that if the U.S. intervenes, and given the fact that we have known U.S. casualties and potential hostages that may still be alive, there's a lot of reasons why the U.S. is going to get involved to get our people out. It's also important to put our assets within the region because not only does obviously Israel have their Iron Dome, but the U.S. carrier group has their own THAAD system and other ways to mitigate against an Iranian strike, given the distance that we know their missiles can move from. Yemen has threatened that they have missiles. We are unsure if that is the case at this point in time. So the importance of the U.S. presence also gives you an idea of just the size and scale of how this could spread and what the contagion could look like. And it looks like it starts small because obviously Israel, Jordan, that whole region is a smaller part, but on a landmass basis, a lot of this isn't populated, and some of the more densely populated areas are going to be involved, and there are a lot of subgroups that would have an interest in going after Israel, as well as not only just NATO, but also U.S. assets. So then when we start looking at some of the economic impacts, these are these Israeli gas fields and pipelines. You get an idea of what is existing. The Ashkelon is the area right there that, as you can see, feeds into into Egypt. So when you look at volumes going into Egypt, from Egypt into the LNG market, this becomes a bigger concern in terms of what is going to be the availability in the Mediterranean, because Italy was expecting this to help kind of counter some of the pressures from Russia and the availability of gas in the region. They've Gaza announced that, I think it was 5 p.m. local time, that they were going to do a strike on Ashkelon. So that has been shut down. There is no gas going through until that has been done. And then the Ashdod, the one that is just essentially you have Gaza City, Ashkelon, Ashdod. Ashdod is the one that a lot of the fertilizer comes to, so potash prices have gone up. Nitrogen and ammonia prices were going up prior to this, and obviously with the loss of natural gas, the additional flows that were expected not coming on is going to have a much bigger impact. Now, this puts into perspective the Rafah border crossing, and then what the West Bank is, as well as that dotted line, which is, again, bleeding into Syria. So you might think, well, why would Iran want to try to really get involved? And if you think about what the Israelis have been very effective at, it's going after Iranian assets within Syria by striking different cargoes, different types of military assets within there, really without much problems because of the Iranian leak or the leaking information from the Iranian government. Now, this also lends the credibility of, well, why did Israel not know about this? So there's been rumors based on what Egypt has said that they informed Israel 10 days ago, or now it's 14 days ago, that something was happening in Gaza. And realistically, Israel has fairly good handle on what's happening within Iran. So if Iran was really a big mastermind behind this, how was that not getting through the system? Now, this is the other problem is, and again, being kind of lulled to sleep, it's happened in the U.S. I mean, look at 9/11. There were rumors happening prior to, but they were deemed either non-credible or, a low-level risk. And when you have that credibility side, that then, again, doesn't get the manpower to really dig into, is this a likely event? And then, obviously, that's where the mastermind of the Gaza plan happened. But it's important to look at the amount of volume. So the picture on the left goes through, and that's just the density data from 2021, gives you an idea of just how much flow happens from these regions and the level of activity that takes place. So when you look at some of these, and it's important to also look at the fact that Lebanon and Israel actually made a deal on gas assets within the coast. So there's going to be that back and forth of, where is Hezbollah versus the Lebanese government versus the locals? And then obviously, what is the potential pinch points when you look at the Suez as well as around Yemen and the Strait of Hormuz? And this is also key because when you look at the U.S. moving assets into the Mediterranean, you can't take your eye off the ball. We have to be everywhere all at once. And the Ronald Reagan Carrier Strike Group remains in South Korea, remains in the region. When you look at the U.S. Navy heading for the LOC and the biggest show of strength. So then you look at what China's done. They apparently they've been their Coast Guard has been operating near the Japanese coastal islands. North Korea had said that they're going to have a big announcement, and then South Korea said that there was a chance of a a Gaza type attack on South Korea. And so you have to look at some of these key pieces. Now, the big picture, U.S.-China ties are on a more stable footing today than they were a couple of months ago. That's good, but at the same time, are they trying to lull us to a false sense of comfort? Realistically, it's unlikely that they have the capacity to try to take Taiwan, but it doesn't mean that they're not going to saber rattle. They're not going to make things difficult or a lot of noise. We do have a lot of assets in the region, and realistically, things are set to improve on a marginal basis. Schumer has had a fairly successful trip to China, but again, the tensions are structurally higher than they have been over the past decade, and it's unlikely that's going to pivot, but you can kind of have a pause point, and China wants to remain neutral when you look at Israel. But at the same time, there's going to be an impetus to not show support for Iran. India has already come out vehemently in favor of what's happened on the Israeli side, condemning, at the strongest level possible, showing support, because Israel was a key piece of India, UAE, Israel, Europe, US. So there's a lot they have riding on this, which is, again, more reasons why Iran wants to get in the way, why they want to try to slow this, because Gaza has nothing to gain. When you look at where it is, people have called it an open air prison, but it's like, well, when you threaten to kill Israelis, and then you say, well, if we let you cross border, are you still going to kill us? Well, yes. And it's like, well, how is this going to structure? How is this two-state solution going to work? Which is why at this point they're going to go back to the 2005 level, where, for those that don't know, in 2005 Israel pulled out. They pulled about 25 settlements out of Gaza, left them to their own rule. That will most likely completely get unwound. You will see IDF presence within Gaza, settlements starting to crop back up and trying to create that influence within there once again. But it's important to show that the U.S. is not just focusing on one entity, because there's a lot of things happening right now, and we have to make sure to be vigilant on a lot of levels. Here's another one. So the Russian survey vessel was conducting underwater activities in the Baltic connector pipeline throughout the summer, and there's now a hole in the pipeline. So Finland suspects that Russia attacked its critical infrastructure, and this just gives you an idea of what the Baltic connector looks like from Finland down into Estonia. And the gas pipeline, the Baltic connector, started leaking. So there is, and now, mind you, Finland is a part of NATO. Is this a known strike? Again, these are the psyops that are happening on different levels, but also the general operation. So this is some sort of terroristic act, sabotage. This is what happens when people are trying to stay relevant in different levels, and Russia, trying to project strength. Obviously, Iran trying to protect strength, and it's important to not have these catch up, because then you have Armenia or Azerbaijan, you have Kosovo, Bosnia. There's a lot of things that are ratcheting up rapidly that we have to stay in front of. Now, when we start looking at geopolitical risk on these different levels, there's obviously disruptive technologies, which is one thing, but high inflation, economic downturn, and escalation of geopolitical risk. The problem is those are very interconnected. And that's going back to the very beginning of this segment. We talked about how the drop in economic activity, the impacts of COVID were going to be lasting. The impacts of inflation were going to drive up the cost of food, of basic necessities, and really drive that pain down to the very base level. And it's not just emerging markets, it's advanced economies, which are seeing labor supply, human capital, all of these things deteriorating because of our cost of living, because of housing. It's not just emerging markets, it's a broad issue around the world. And it's important to look at, what happens with crude at this point, which has been a big driver of this inflationary pressure. When you look at the spare sustainable capacity, there's almost 6 million barrels a day offline. A large part of that is Saudi Arabia. So when you look at what is deemed to be the current demand supply gap, it could be filled fairly quickly. It's just they're choosing not to, which is why we're seeing these levels. For those that have been following us, we said we were going to be at an elevated level. We were saying 88 to 96 was kind of the range. Obviously, it fell through. But we said that when it got to 84 or 84, 85, that the next move up was going to be 90, not 80. And here we are. Obviously, the geopolitical side is a huge piece, and it's going to be an important thing to watch as we go forward, we don't see these barrels coming out. And it should also be said that Saudi Arabia was in discussion that part of the Israeli deal or normalizing of relations would have brought more crude back to the market. Now, is that something Iran wants, given where pricing is? But realistically, they've also put additional pressure on them. So here on the left is where you get that black chart with the white line is where their current production is. The Iranian crude and condensate exports, according to Kepler, are about 1.5 million. It's likely, obviously, all to come down now. There's no reason why the U.S. isn't going to bring back sanctions. There was $6 billion that was released, starting to sanction things up, and we've turned a blind eye to these cargoes that have loaded. But given the level of the sluggishness on Golden Week in China, the sluggishness in Asian activity and continuing others, there's going to be a show of force against what happened at Iran's potential involvement. It could be the walk back that they're trying to do now is because they're finding out that people are not willing to buy their crude at this point because they're like, look, you did something terrible. We're not going to be there to support you. We have crude in storage. We can get the additional from Russia. There's no impetus to come to your aid at this point in time as the sanctions are going to get ramped up again. Now, this is where it's important to look at the nuclear warhead inventories or the estimated inventories. What is deployed, what is non-deployed, non-strategic, strategic. It's no surprise to know where the U.S. has their assets. We are fairly well positioned in terms of what is actively deployed, not only just in Eastern Europe, in floating assets, both known and unknown. And it's something that we have the ability to ramp that up quickly. It's assumed we know what China has. That's always an unknown. Pakistan, India. We've had in the air one of our what's called atomic sniffers or nuke sniffers, just seeing if there was any activity that is happening. And again, it's just important of trying to be vigilant as you get these massive change in geopolitical shifts. This is just giving you an idea of how Russia's trying to get crude to market. The existing or potential Russian projects, as well as Russian oil shipments to China since July 15th. And it's, again, going up over the Arctic Circle, coming in, which is obviously a much faster route than trying to go all the way around. And it gives you an idea of how Russia is trying to remain relevant, at the same time financing their own war vehicle. But the bigger problem now, when you start looking at, and it goes both ways, because as Israel requires more equipment, ammo, that's going to pull assets that might have been deployed into Ukraine. But then how much of this was siphoned from Russia down into Iran and into Gaza? Is there a certain amount that was going the other way as well? Because Russia has been dropping a significant amount of artillery, amount of missiles, rockets, and it's going to counterbalance. And that's where it's a matter of maintaining stockpiles, increasing activity on the manufacturing front to make sure that you can stay ahead of any bigger escalation and being prepared for what comes next. And that's why, just to come back to it, you have to, as the art of war says, you can never underestimate your enemy. And the biggest issue that Israel had is they underestimated where Gaza sat. And again, that's why it was an impressive attack, in terms of its sophistication, its organization, not something that they've done before. And that's a new pivot on why things are not going back to be the same, because you can't let that level of sophistication happen again, because then, the deaths will get more, things will get greater, the escalation will move up, and it's better off to strike hard and fast. Obviously, fast in a controlled fashion, because you don't want to go over your skis or, again, underestimate your opponent. And from a U.S. perspective, you don't want to underestimate where things sit. You don't want to underestimate how angry people are, how the socioeconomic impacts have been, because this is going to create a certain amount of cohesion on a tribal divide that's going to have to be dealt with, and you have to make sure it's dealt in a controlled fashion so that you're not overstretched, but meeting force with force and trying to maximize your deterrence and showing that strength. So that's what we have for you on this side. I know it's a lot. A lot of things it's obviously very fluid. A lot of this could even change once we're done filming this. And in the next segment, we're going to go deeper into kind of the global impacts and how things have shifted on the global front when you look at some of the economic pressures that continue, which again was part of that impetus and the problems that we've seen to date.